Emma softened, her gaze steady and kind. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she said simply. "And I think you've done a lot with yours." Victoria's eyes glistened, and she nodded, her voice catching as she spoke. "I have tried," she said. "I've been volunteering at the community center, and it's been humbling. Eye-opening even. I've met so many people whose stories have changed the way I see the world and myself." Emma felt a swell of pride for Victoria, though she knew this journey was hers alone. "That's amazing, Victoria. I'm really proud of you." Victoria's smile widened, though there was a hint of emotion in her expression. "I wanted to thank you in person," she said, her tone earnest. "What you said to me that day, it stuck with me. It made me realize how much of my life I've spent running from things I needed to face. And because of you, I finally feel like I'm starting to." Emma's heart tightened, a wave of emotion washing over her. She placed a hand on Victoria's arm, her touch light but grounding. "I didn't do this for you," she said gently. "You did this for yourself. All I did was hold up a mirror." Victoria nodded, her throat tight with gratitude. "Still, you didn't have to," she said. "You could have walked away, but you didn't. And that means more to me than I can say." The two women found themselves sitting at a nearby cafe, the same one where Emma had sat quietly just weeks ago before their fateful encounter. The atmosphere was warm, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods wrapping around them like a comforting embrace. "So, how's life treating you these days?" Emma asked, sipping her coffee. Victoria exhaled, her expression thoughtful. "Better," she said honestly. "I'm not going to lie, there are days when I feel like I'm still fighting old habits. But now, instead of running from that fight, I'm facing it." Emma nodded, her respect for Victoria deepening. "That's all anyone can do," she said. "Change isn't a straight line, it's a series of steps, some forward, some back. The important thing is that you keep moving." Victoria leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the bustling atrium outside the cafe. "I've been thinking a lot about how we judge people," she said. "Not just others, but ourselves. I used to think perfection was the goal, but now I see it's connection that matters most." Emma's lips curved into a small smile. "That's a hard lesson to learn, but a beautiful one." Victoria turned back to Emma, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I hope I can do for someone else what you did for me," she said. "I want to be that mirror for someone, help them see who they can become." Emma reached across the table, her hand covering Victoria's. "You already are," she said softly. "And I think you'll be even more than that." As they left the cafe, Victoria hesitated. "Before I go," she said, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Emma tilted her head, curious. "What's that?" Victoria took a deep breath. "How did you know what to say to me that day? How did you stay so calm when I was being so awful?" Emma's expression softened, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned through experience. "Because I've been where you were," she said simply. "I've felt that same fear, that same need to protect myself by putting others down. And I've learned that judgment is a reflection of our own pain. I saw myself in you, Victoria, and I wanted to remind you of the person you could be." Victoria's throat tightened, and she blinked rapidly to keep her emotions in check. "You're a remarkable person, Emma," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for seeing something in me when I couldn't see it myself." Emma smiled, her warmth radiating. "And thank you for proving that people can change. You're a remarkable person too, Victoria. Don't forget that." As they parted ways, Victoria walked to her car with a lighter step, her heart fuller than it had been in years. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. She carried Emma's words with her like a compass, guiding her toward a version of herself she was finally ready to embrace. And Emma? She left the mall with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that one small moment of empathy had created ripples far beyond what she could have imagined. It was a reminder that the power of connection, real, honest connection, was always worth the effort. The soft glow of the setting sun bathed the quiet streets in gold as Emma Bennett sat by the window of her cozy living room, a cup of chamomile tea cradled in her hands. It had been weeks since her encounter with Victoria Caldwell, weeks filled with reflections, interviews, and countless stories from strangers who had reached out to share how the video had touched their lives. Yet tonight, Emma was grateful for the stillness, the chance to sit with her thoughts and process everything that had unfolded. She stared out the window, watching leaves drift lazily to the ground, her mind replaying moments from the past few months. What had started as a seemingly ordinary day at the mall had grown into something far bigger, a conversation that not only changed one woman's life, but also sparked ripples of empathy in ways Emma could never have predicted. Her phone buzzed softly on the table beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a notification from an online forum where the video was still being discussed. Curious, she opened the thread and began scrolling through the new comments. One post stood out. "I watched the video again today, and it made me realize how often I judge people without even thinking about it. Yesterday, I apologized to a coworker for something I said months ago, and we had the most honest conversation we've ever had. Thank you for showing us that change starts with small moments." Emma's chest tightened with emotion. She placed the phone down and took a steadying breath, allowing herself to feel the weight of what this journey had meant not just for her, but for everyone it had touched. It was a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary acts could hold extraordinary power. Across town, Victoria stood in front of a full-length mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the name tag on her sweater. It read, "Volunteer Coordinator." She had been asked to take on a leadership role at the community center, a testament to the progress she had made and the trust she had earned. As she smoothed the fabric, her gaze lingered on her reflection. She no longer saw the person who had once hidden behind designer labels and judgment. Instead, she saw someone who was learning to embrace imperfection, someone who was finding joy in connecting with others. The shift had been slow, messy at times, but it was real. Her thoughts turned to Emma, the woman who had sparked this change in her. She had replayed their conversations countless times, each word a guiding light on her path to growth. Victoria smiled to herself, a quiet, grateful smile, before grabbing her bag and heading out the door. At the community center, the atmosphere was lively. Children laughed as they played with donated toys, and volunteers buzzed around, organizing supplies and assisting families. Victoria moved through the room with ease, her presence calm yet confident. She stopped to chat with a young mother who was picking out winter coats for her children. "Thank you for everything you do here," the woman said, her voice sincere. "It means so much to families like mine." Victoria felt a lump form in her throat, but she smiled warmly. "It's my pleasure," she replied. "I've learned so much from being here, more than I ever thought possible." The woman nodded, her eyes kind. Sometimes helping others is the best way to help yourself. Victoria paused, the words sinking in. She thought of Emma again, of how one simple moment of connection had set her on this journey. The realization filled her with a quiet sense of purpose. Later that evening, Emma's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Victoria. "Hi, Emma. I just wanted you to know I'm doing okay. More than okay, actually. Volunteering has become a huge part of my life, and it's helped me see the world in a way I never did before. Thank you for believing in me. I'll never forget what you said, Change isn't a straight line, but the important thing is to keep moving. I'm moving, Emma. And it feels good. Emma read the message twice, a soft smile spreading across her face. She replied quickly, Victoria, I'm so proud of you. You've done the hard work, and it shows. Keep going, you're making a bigger difference than you know. Placing her phone back on the table, Emma leaned back in her chair, a profound sense of peace settling over her. This was why she had chosen to stay calm that day in the mall, why she had chosen empathy over judgment. Because moments like these, moments of transformation and connection, were what truly mattered. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of that single encounter continued to unfold. The video inspired community discussions, school workshops, and even corporate training sessions about empathy and inclusion. Emma found herself speaking at events, sharing the lessons she had learned about vulnerability and kindness. Victoria became a pillar of her community, leading initiatives at the center and mentoring others who are navigating their own paths of self-discovery. But beyond the public recognition and the larger conversations, the true legacy of that day lay in the countless small acts of empathy. It inspired apologies made, judgments reconsidered, connections formed. It was a reminder that change didn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it began with a quiet conversation between two people willing to listen. And so, as Emma sipped her tea and watched the world outside her window, she reflected on the quiet truth she had come to embrace. Every small act of kindness mattered. Every word spoken with empathy carried the power to ripple outward, touching lives in ways no one could predict. The world wasn't perfect, and neither were its people. But in moments of grace and understanding, Emma saw glimpses of the world. It could become a world built not on judgment, but on connection. And that, she thought with a smile, was a world worth working toward. Victoria hesitated, her mind racing. She had spent so much of her life avoiding scrutiny, terrified of what people might see. But in this moment, she realized that hiding hadn't protected her, it had only isolated her further. Slowly, she nodded. Okay, she said, her voice quiet but resolute. If it helps someone else, then okay. The man smiled, stepping back to capture the moment. Emma and Victoria exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. It wasn't about being perfect or polished, it was about being real. As the man walked away, Victoria turned back to Emma, her expression lighter, though still tinged with uncertainty. Thank you, she said, her voice sincere, for not giving up on me. Emma smiled, her warmth radiating. You're welcome, she said. And for what it's worth, I think you're stronger than you realize. The two women parted ways, each carrying the weight of the conversation, but also the hope it had sparked. For Victoria, it was the beginning of a journey she hadn't planned but desperately needed. For Emma, it was a reminder of the quiet power of showing up with empathy and grace. The sunlight outside Willow Creek Mall began to soften, casting long shadows as the day edged toward evening. Inside, the mall buzzed with its usual energy, oblivious to the quiet ripple that had begun to form. Emma Bennett had left the atrium, her heart lighter but reflective, while Victoria Caldwell lingered in the parking lot, staring at her own reflection in the glossy black surface of her car. Her face was a mix of exhaustion and relief, the kind that only comes after the release of long-held tension. Unbeknownst to either of them, a video of their interaction was making its way through social media. The bystander who had recorded the moment had posted it with a simple caption, "Empathy in action." A conversation that changed everything. Within hours, the video began to pick up traction. It wasn't flashy or sensational, just two women standing in the middle of a mall, one offering kindness, the other struggling with vulnerability. But there was something about it that resonated deeply with people. The rawness of the exchange, the way Emma spoke with quiet conviction, and the visible shift in Victoria's demeanor struck a chord that words alone could not. By the next morning, Emma's phone buzzed incessantly. Notifications poured in texts, emails, social media tags, all from people she hadn't heard from in years. Her closest friend, Mia, was the first to call. "Emma, have you seen this?" Mia's voice was an odd mix of excitement and disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Emma asked groggily, fumbling for her coffee cup as she sat at her kitchen table. "The video," Mia said. "The one from the mall yesterday. It's everywhere. People are sharing it like crazy." Emma froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "Wait, what video?" Mia quickly explained, and as soon as the call ended, Emma opened her phone to find herself staring back from the screen. Her words to Victoria played on loop. "Judgment doesn't help you heal, it just distracts you from your own pain." The comments beneath the video were overwhelmingly supportive. This is the kind of conversation we need more of, so powerful. We all need an Emma in our lives. I didn't expect to cry over a mall video, but here we are. Emma's stomach churned. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, and the sudden influx of messages left her feeling exposed. But as she scrolled through the responses, she saw something that struck her deeply: stories. People were sharing their own experiences, moments when they had been judged, times they had made mistakes, and instances where someone's kindness had changed their perspective. The thread became a digital tapestry of vulnerability, weaving together strangers who felt seen for the first time in a long while. Meanwhile, Victoria woke up to a different kind of reality. Her social media notifications were also overflowing, but the messages she received were a stark contrast to Emma's. Some were harsh, calling her out for her initial judgment. Others were softer, expressing hope that her vulnerability would inspire others to reflect on their own actions. At first, she wanted to throw her phone across the room, overwhelmed by the weight of public scrutiny. But as she read through the comments, one stood out. "It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong. Thank you for showing us what it means to take the first step toward change." Victoria stared at the words for a long time. Her instinct had always been to shield herself from criticism, to defend her choices no matter what. But now, for the first time, she felt a strange sense of gratitude for being seen not as perfect, but as real. By the afternoon, major news outlets had picked up the video, using it as a springboard to discuss deeper societal issues: the prevalence of judgment, the power of empathy, and the way small acts of kindness could ripple outward. In one segment, a journalist reflected, "We often think change has to come in big, dramatic gestures. But sometimes it's a quiet conversation between two people, a moment of raw honesty, that has the greatest impact." People across the country began to take notice. Hashtags like #EmpathyInAction and #SmallSteps Big Change trended on. Teachers discussed the video with their students, using it as an example of emotional intelligence and the importance of looking beyond appearances. Emma, despite her aversion to the spotlight, agreed to do a short interview with a local news station. Sitting in the cozy nook of a neighborhood cafe, she spoke softly, but with conviction. "This wasn't about me," Emma said, her hands clasped tightly around her coffee cup. "It was about creating space for someone to be honest about their pain, their fears, and their hopes. We all carry things that no one else can see, and I think the more we choose to meet each other with empathy instead of judgment, the better off we'll all be." The interviewer nodded, visibly moved. "And what would you say to people who are inspired by this moment, but don't know where to start?" Emma smiled, her expression warm yet thoughtful. "Start small," she said. "Listen to someone's story without interrupting. Apologize when you've been wrong. Offer a kind word when someone needs it. These aren't grand gestures, but they're powerful. Because when we choose empathy, we're not just helping others, we're helping ourselves too. As the video continued to circulate, its impact grew beyond what either Emma or Victoria could have imagined. Strangers began sharing acts of kindness inspired by their story, paying for a neighbor's groceries, writing heartfelt apologies to estranged friends, or simply pausing to ask someone how they were doing. And through it all, Emma remained quietly proud, not of herself, but of the countless people who had chosen to turn a fleeting moment into a movement. Victoria Caldwell sat at her dining table, a blank notebook open in front of her. The early morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of her modern home, illuminating the tidy perfection she had worked so hard to maintain. But today, the order and symmetry brought her no comfort. Her mind churned, replaying fragments of the conversation at Willow Creek Mall and the waves it had created in her life. The video had changed everything. She'd spent the last week oscillating between shame and hope, reading the comments under the video that exposed her vulnerability to the world. Some were kind, praising her courage to admit fault. Others were less forgiving, calling her judgmental and shallow. Yet, in the swirl of public opinion, one voice lingered in her mind, Emma's. Victoria could still hear Emma's words, as clear as if they had been spoken that morning. It's not about what people think of you, it's about knowing who you are and being okay with it. For years, Victoria had avoided reflecting on her life too deeply, afraid of what she might find. But something about Emma's grace and the quiet power of their exchange had shifted something inside her. She was tired of running from herself. Victoria tapped her pen nervously against the table before finally putting it to the paper. The first words came slowly, hesitant like a child learning to write for the first time. What am I afraid of? The question felt heavy, its answer too complicated to fit into the neat lines of her notebook. But instead of stopping, Victoria let the pen move freely, pouring out thoughts she had never allowed herself to voice. I'm afraid of failing. I'm afraid of being seen as weak. I'm afraid that if people knew the real me, they wouldn't like me. Tears pricked her eyes as she continued to write, the pen carving out the fears she had carried for years but never named. With each word, she felt a strange mixture of pain and relief, as though a weight she didn't realize she had been carrying was finally being lifted. When she finished, she stared at the page, her handwriting uneven and raw. It wasn't pretty or polished, but it was honest. And for the first time in a long time, Victoria felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel, hope. Later that day, she found herself scrolling through her phone, searching for Emma's contact information. She had saved the video, not to relive the embarrassment, but to remind herself of the moment everything had changed. One of the bystanders who posted it had tagged Emma, making it easier for Victoria to find her. Her thumb hovered over the message button, her nerves crackling with uncertainty. What could she possibly say? Would Emma even want to hear from her? The thought of rejection made her stomach churn, but she forced herself to remember Emma's words. The first step is always the hardest. With a deep breath, she typed a simple message. Hi, Emma. This is Victoria. I wanted to thank you for what you said to me that day at the mall. It's been on my mind ever since, and it's made me want to change. I know I have a lot to work on, but I just wanted you to know that you made a difference. Thank you. Her finger hesitated over the send button before she finally pressed it. As the message disappeared into the digital ether, she sat back, her heart pounding. Emma received the message later that evening. She had spent the day responding to emails and interview requests, overwhelmed by the attention the video had brought. But when she saw Victoria's name, she paused. A smile touched her lips as she read the words. It wasn't long or elaborate, but it was sincere, and that was all Emma needed to know. She replied almost immediately, "Hi, Victoria. Thank you for reaching out. It means a lot to hear that. Change isn't easy, but the fact that you're open to it says so much about who you are. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. Take care of yourself, you're on the right path." Victoria read the message over and over, her heart swelling with gratitude. It wasn't just the words, it was the kindness behind them. Emma hadn't judged her, hadn't dismissed her as irredeemable. Instead, she had offered understanding, something Victoria wasn't sure she deserved but desperately needed. The next day, Victoria took her first tangible step toward change. She reached out to a local community center, offering to volunteer. The idea terrified her, putting herself in a space where she'd have to interact with strangers, some of whom might not fit the image of perfection she had clung to for so long. But she reminded herself that growth required discomfort, and discomfort was a sign she was moving in the right direction. Her first shift was spent sorting donated clothes. The irony wasn't lost on her as she folded sweaters and jeans much like the ones she had once mocked. But as she worked alongside the other volunteers, she began to see the humanity in each item, the stories they carried, the lives they had touched. It humbled her in a way she hadn't expected. That evening, Victoria sat down with her notebook again. This time, the words came more easily. She wrote about the people she had met at the center, the small but meaningful ways they had taught her to see the world differently. And for the first time in years, she ended her entry with a sentence that surprised even herself. "I think I might be okay after all." It was a crisp Saturday morning, and the air carried the unmistakable scent of fall damp leaves, cool earth, and the faint sweetness of cider from the cafe near the entrance to Willow Creek Mall. Emma Bennett had just finished her weekly grocery shopping and decided to stop by the mall to pick up a birthday gift for her niece. As she stepped through the sliding glass doors, she felt a strange wave of nostalgia. It had been weeks since the encounter that had changed more than just her day. It had sparked a movement. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. Emma turned, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized Victoria Caldwell standing a few feet away. Dressed casually in a soft sweater and jeans, Victoria looked entirely different from the polished, guarded woman Emma had met before. Her expression was tentative but warm, her hands clasped in front of her as if she were bracing herself. "Victoria," Emma said, her voice tinged with surprise. "It's good to see you." Victoria took a step closer, her smile small but genuine. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to talk to me again," she admitted, her voice quiet. "But I hoped you might." Emma's brows knitted together in a mix of curiosity and compassion. "Why wouldn't I want to talk to you?" Victoria hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because of the way I acted before. Because I wasn't the kind of person anyone would want to give a second chance to." The crowd had mostly dispersed by now, leaving the two women in an almost intimate bubble of conversation. The tension that had filled the air moments ago was replaced by something quieter, more profound, a shared understanding that hinted at the possibility of growth. Emma took a step back, giving Victoria the space to process what had just unfolded. "It's never too late," Emma said, offering a small, encouraging smile. "But the first step is always the hardest." Victoria nodded faintly, her expression unreadable but introspective. For the first time, Emma thought she saw a glimmer of someone who wanted to change. The atrium of Willow Creek Mall seemed quieter now, the buzz of shoppers muted as Emma Bennett and Victoria Caldwell stood facing each other. Though the confrontation that had drawn a small crowd earlier had simmered down, its echoes still lingered in the space between them. The air was heavy not with hostility, but with the weight of unspoken truths. Victoria adjusted the strap of her handbag nervously, her polished demeanor now visibly cracking. She avoided Emma's gaze, her eyes darting to the gleaming marble floor. "You think I don't know how it feels," she said finally, her voice strained, as though forcing the words out was an act of courage. Emma tilted her head slightly, her expression curious but gentle. "How it feels?" she asked, her tone low, inviting, but not pressuring. "To feel invisible," Victoria said, her voice trembling. "To feel like you don't belong. Like no matter how hard you try, there's always someone ready to remind you that you'll never be enough." The vulnerability in her words caught Emma off guard. She had braced herself for defensiveness, maybe even anger, but not this raw, unfiltered honesty that seemed to pour out of Victoria against her will. Emma leaned back slightly, giving her space, but her gaze never wavered. Victoria's hands trembled as she clasped them together. "I grew up in a town no one's ever heard of," she continued, her words coming faster now, as if afraid she might lose her nerve. "We didn't have much, barely enough to keep the lights on some months. I went to school in hand-me-down clothes that didn't fit, with shoes so worn out they let the rain in. And every single day I felt it." She paused, swallowing hard. The looks, the whispers, the way people avoided sitting next to me because I wasn't their kind. Emma felt her chest tighten, a pang of empathy coursing through her. She pictured a younger Victoria, smaller, quieter, and burdened by the weight of expectations she hadn't asked for. Emma had never imagined that the woman standing before her, with her designer handbag and expensive blazer, carried such a heavy past. "I told myself I'd never go back to that life," Victoria said, her voice firmer now, though the cracks of emotion were still evident. "I worked so hard to get out, to build something, to prove I was more than the girl with holes in her shoes." Emma nodded slowly, sensing that this was a story Victoria had rarely, if ever, shared. "And you did," she said softly. "You built something. But at what cost?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Victoria flinched, her carefully constructed walls visibly crumbling. "I thought if I could just look the part, act the part, then maybe people would finally see me differently. Respect me." Emma's voice softened even more. "And did it work?" Victoria let out a shaky laugh, though there was no joy in it. "Not really," she admitted. "It's never enough. There's always someone richer, someone more polished, someone ready to remind you where you came from. And it eats at you. So you start looking for someone else to put below you. Someone to make you feel like you've made it." Emma's heart ached at the confession. It wasn't just an explanation, it was a glimpse into the fragile humanity that connected them both. She could see how years of struggle had shaped Victoria, hardening her in some places while leaving others tender and raw. "You know," Emma said after a moment, her voice thoughtful, "when you first walked up to me, I thought you were just another person trying to put me in my place. But now I see that the only person you're really fighting is yourself." Victoria's breath hitched, and her eyes finally met Emma's. There was no malice there now, only a deep weariness that spoke volumes. "Maybe I am," she said quietly, almost to herself. Emma took a step closer, her tone earnest but calm. "We all carry wounds, Victoria. Some are visible, and some aren't. But if we don't face them, if we let them dictate how we treat others, we just end up passing the hurt along." The words seemed to pierce through Victoria's defenses. She bit her lip, blinking rapidly as if to ward off tears. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted, her voice breaking. Emma offered a small, understanding smile. "It starts with moments like this," she said gently. "With choosing to see someone else not as a reflection of your pain, but as a person with their own story. It's not easy, and it's not instant, but it's possible. Victoria nodded faintly, her expression a mixture of shame and hope. For the first time, the tightly wound image she had presented seemed to relax, giving way to something more authentic. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "I know," Emma replied, her voice warm. "But now that you know better, you have a choice. You can let today be just another moment you regret, or it can be the moment you start to change." Victoria didn't reply immediately. She simply stood there, her expression contemplative, as if turning over Emma's words in her mind. The mall buzzed around them, but for the two women, the world seemed to have narrowed to just this conversation. The air between Emma Bennett and Victoria Caldwell felt quieter now, as if the mall itself had taken a collective breath. The tension that had once charged their conversation had given way to something deeper, a moment of stillness where truth could finally settle. Victoria's confession about her past lingered, but now it was Emma's turn to speak, her own thoughts and experiences swirling just beneath the surface. Emma folded her arms loosely across her chest, her gaze steady but thoughtful. "You know," she began, her voice calm yet weighted with meaning, "I didn't always have this much patience. If we'd had this conversation a few years ago, I probably would have snapped back at you. I would have matched your judgment with my own and walked away feeling justified." Victoria looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as curiosity softened the tension in her expression. "What changed?" she asked, her voice hesitant, as though afraid of the answer. Emma allowed herself a small, reflective smile. "Life has a funny way of humbling you," she said. "I used to think I had it all figured out, that I could put people into neat little boxes and move on. But the truth is, everyone's story is a lot more complicated than it seems on the surface." Victoria shifted uncomfortably, her polished exterior still hanging on, but now tinged with an undercurrent of vulnerability. "So, what made you see that?" Emma hesitated for a moment, as though weighing how much of her own story to share. "There was a time," she began slowly, "when I felt invisible too. Not because of how I looked, but because of what I'd lost. A few years ago, I was married, living in a small town, trying to build a life that felt stable. And then, one day, everything I thought I knew about myself and my future was gone." Victoria tilted her head slightly, her curiosity now mingled with a flicker of empathy. "What happened?" she asked, her voice softer now. "My husband left," Emma said plainly, though the rawness in her voice hinted at the pain still lingering beneath the surface. "He decided he wanted something else, someone else, and suddenly, the life I'd spent years building didn't mean anything anymore. I felt like a failure, like I'd done something wrong just by being myself." Victoria's expression shifted, her usual guardedness replaced by something gentler. "That must have been awful," she said quietly, the sincerity in her voice cutting through her usual defenses. Emma nodded, her smile faint but genuine. "It was," she admitted. "For a long time, I let that pain define me. I thought if I could just keep to myself, stay quiet, and avoid judgment, I'd eventually disappear. But the thing about pain is, it doesn't go away just because you ignore it." Victoria frowned slightly, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her handbag. "So what did you do?" she asked, her tone almost urgent, as though Emma's answer might hold the key to her own struggles. Emma took a deep breath, her gaze softening as she looked at Victoria. "I learned that the only way to heal was to face it. To look at myself, not just the parts I liked, but the parts I didn't want to see, and figure out who I wanted to be moving forward. And along the way, I realized that judging other people wasn't helping me. It was just distracting me from my own growth. Victoria's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of Emma's words settling heavily on her. "That's easier said than done," she murmured, her voice tinged with doubt. "Of course it is," Emma agreed, her tone understanding but firm. "But it's worth it. Because every time you choose to look at someone with empathy instead of judgment, you're not just helping them, you're helping yourself too." For a moment, neither woman spoke. The noise of the mall hummed around them, a reminder of the world continuing on its way despite the profound moment unfolding between them. Victoria's eyes glistened faintly, though she quickly blinked away, the emotion threatening to spill over. "You really believe that?" Victoria asked finally, her voice barely audible. Emma nodded without hesitation. "I do," she said simply. "And I think you're already starting to see it too. The fact that you're even asking these questions, that you're willing to admit you've made mistakes, it says a lot about who you are and who you could become." Victoria's lips parted as though she wanted to respond, but no words came. Instead, she looked down at her hands, her carefully manicured nails now trembling slightly. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of something she thought she'd lost, a quiet hope that change might actually be possible. Emma took a small step forward, her voice gentle but unwavering. "You've spent so much of your life trying to prove yourself to others," she said. "But maybe it's time to start proving something to yourself. That you can be more than what you've been through. That you can grow." Victoria swallowed hard, her throat tightening with the weight of unspoken emotions. "I don't know where to start," she admitted, her voice trembling. Emma smiled, her warmth radiating like a quiet beacon. "Start here," she said simply. "Start by being honest with yourself and with the people around you. The rest will follow." The moment between Emma and Victoria stretched into a quiet understanding, their conversation an invisible bridge that spanned two very different lives. Around them, the mall thrummed with its usual weekend energy, children darting between storefronts, couples laughing, and the faint melody of an acoustic guitar drifting from a nearby performer. But for the two women, the world had narrowed to this singular exchange, where vulnerability had opened the door to something unexpected, the possibility of connection. Victoria inhaled deeply, her breath trembling slightly as she exhaled. "I've spent so much time pretending," she admitted, her voice a whisper but no less powerful. "Pretending to have it all together. Pretending that the judgment of others doesn't bother me. But it does. It always has." Emma offered her a small, reassuring smile. "I think we all feel that way at some point," she said. "But the mask we wear to protect ourselves can also become the thing that isolates us." Victoria nodded, her gaze dropping to the polished floor. The glint of her designer heels caught her eye, a stark reminder of the life she had built to escape the pain of her past. "I thought if I could just make myself into someone they couldn't criticize, it would make the hurt go away," she said. "But it hasn't. If anything, it's only made me lonelier." Emma's heart ached for her. She could see the cracks in Victoria's carefully constructed facade, and within them, a woman who was desperate to feel seen, to feel enough. Emma stepped closer, her voice gentle yet firm. "Loneliness doesn't mean you're broken," she said. "It means you're human. And the way out isn't perfection, it's connection." Victoria looked up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. For a moment, she seemed like a different person, not the polished, confident figure who had approached Emma with harsh words, but someone stripped of pretense, standing on the edge of something new. "How do you even start?" she asked, her voice fragile, almost childlike. Emma thought for a moment, her gaze softening. "You start by listening," she said simply. "By showing up not as the version of yourself you think people want, but as the person you really are. and by giving others the chance to do the same. Victoria blinked rapidly, as though trying to absorb Emma's words and hold back her emotions at the same time. The vulnerability in her expression was startling, even to herself. She had spent so many years building walls, constructing an image of success and self-assurance, that she had forgotten what it felt like to let someone see her truth. "I don't know if I can do that," Victoria admitted, her voice trembling. What if people don't like the real me?" Emma's smile widened, her warmth unwavering. "Then those aren't your people," she said softly. "But you'd be surprised how many people will love the real you, flaws and all, if you give them the chance." Victoria's lips pressed together, her emotions warring on her face. "I've been so afraid," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid of being judged. Afraid of being rejected. I thought if I could control how people saw me, I'd feel safe. But I don't." Emma nodded slowly, her expression one of quiet understanding. "Safety doesn't come from what others think of you," she said. "It comes from knowing who you are and being okay with it. And that's not something anyone else can give you. It's something you have to find for yourself." The weight of Emma's words settled over Victoria like a blanket, heavy, yet comforting. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope that she could step out from behind her carefully constructed image and still be enough. "I want to try," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I don't know how, but I want to." Emma reached out, gently touching Victoria's arm. "That's all you need to start," she said warmly. "The rest will come." The exchange was quiet, but its impact was profound. Around them, the mall continued its lively rhythm, but for Emma and Victoria, the moment felt sacred, a turning point neither of them had anticipated, but both needed. As the two women stood there, a man with a camera phone approached hesitantly. "Excuse me," he said, his tone careful. "I couldn't help but overhear. And well, I think what just happened here is something people need to see." Victoria stiffened, her instinct to retreat flaring up immediately. But Emma placed a steadying hand on her arm, her touch reassuring. "It's up to you," Emma said gently, her gaze meeting Victoria's. "But sometimes sharing our story is how we help others see themselves." Emma Bennett, a 38-year-old freelance writer, found herself enjoying a rare Saturday off. She strolled through the bustling corridors of Willow Creek Mall, the faint aroma of cinnamon buns wafting through the air, mingling with the hum of weekend shoppers. A late afternoon glow spilled through the skylights, bathing the scene in warmth. With a steaming cup of coffee in hand, Emma settled into a bench near the central atrium. Her faded jeans and oversized sweater, though comfortable, bore the marks of many washes, a stark contrast to the polished aesthetic of the mall's regulars. She took a slow sip of her coffee, allowing herself a moment to people watch. Families bustled past, children clutching balloons from the toy store, and teenagers moved in tight-knit groups, their laughter bouncing off the glass storefronts. To Emma, the scene was a patchwork of life's little stories, a mosaic she often drew inspiration from for her writing. But her tranquility was abruptly shattered. A sharp voice broke through the mall's ambient noise. "Excuse me, but you can't just sit here all day." Emma looked up, her gaze meeting that of a woman who stood before her, her silhouette outlined against the light. The woman's tailored blazer and pristine designer handbag spoke volumes about her status. She was the kind of person who commanded attention not just because of her appearance, but because of the unmistakable air of authority she carried. Emma blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry, are you talking to me?" she asked, her tone polite, but tinged with confusion. "Yes, you." The woman crossed her arms, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her forearm. This isn't a place for loitering. People like you shouldn't." She paused, her eyes scanning Emma's attire, as if the mere act of doing so confirmed her suspicion. "Linger here." Emma's stomach tightened. The words "people like you" hung in the air, sharp and cutting. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "I'm not loitering," she said evenly, though her voice carried an edge. "I'm sitting here, enjoying my coffee like everyone else." The woman raised an eyebrow, her expression a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "I doubt that." For a moment, silence stretched between them, a tense standoff that seemed to slow the bustling world around them. Emma could feel eyes turning their way, shoppers slowing down to steal glances at the confrontation. The mall's chatter dulled, as if the space itself had tuned into this unfolding scene. Emma set her coffee cup down, her fingers tightening around its cardboard sleeve. She knew the type this wasn't about her, not really. It was about power, about assumptions, about someone seeing her and deciding she didn't fit the image they had crafted in their mind. She straightened her posture and met the woman's gaze head-on. "I don't know who you think you are, but I have just as much right to be here as you do." The woman's lips parted, but no words came out. For a fleeting second, vulnerability flickered across her face, quickly replaced by a defensive glare. She opened her mouth to retort, but Emma cut her off. "Look, I don't know what's going on in your life," Emma said, her voice softening. "But judging someone based on what they're wearing or how they look, it says more about you than it does about me." The woman's face reddened, her expression wavering between indignation and something harder to place, embarrassment perhaps. She glanced around, noticing the growing number of onlookers who now lingered, curiosity evident in their stares. The attention seemed to unnerve her, and for a moment her confidence faltered. Emma felt her own pulse quicken, but she maintained her composure. Inside, emotions swirled: anger, hurt, and a deep-seated exhaustion from years of navigating moments like these. But there was also resolve, a quiet strength that had carried her through tougher days. As the seconds ticked by, the woman's sharp exterior began to crack. But before either of them could speak again, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, rippling through the air like an unspoken judgment. Emma could feel their presence behind her, silent witnesses to this unexpected encounter. Her heart raced, but she reminded herself, "Stay calm. Be firm, but don't lose your ground." And so she waited, meeting the woman's gaze with a steady, unflinching resolve. The woman's gaze burned with quiet indignation as the crowd around them swelled. Emma Bennett remained seated on the bench, her fingers still wrapped around her coffee cup, but her heart beat heavily in her chest. She could feel the weight of the moment, not just the woman's accusation, but the silent judgment of those who now watched from the sidelines. "I just don't see why someone would come to a place like this looking." The woman hesitated, searching for a word that wouldn't entirely betray her thoughts, but still cut deep. "So out of place." Emma tilted her head slightly, a flicker of incredulity crossing her face. "Out of place?" she repeated, her voice calm but pointed. "I didn't realize there was a dress code for buying coffee and sitting in a public space." The woman straightened, as if the defensive tone would lend her more authority. "It's not about a dress code. It's about respect. Respect for yourself, for the place you're in. Don't you think appearances matter?" Emma couldn't help but let out a soft laugh, short, dry, almost bitter. "Appearances," she echoed. "Is that what this is about? Because, forgive me, but I didn't think wearing an old sweater and jeans meant I was disrespecting anyone." The tension was palpable now, the kind of charged energy that made it impossible to ignore what was happening. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, yet no one dared to intervene. Some whispered in hushed tones, while others held their phones at an angle that suggested they were capturing the scene. Emma noticed the glow of a recording light on one of the devices and sighed inwardly. Of course, she thought. This is how these moments always go, isn't it? But Emma wasn't here to put on a show. This wasn't about proving the woman wrong in front of an audience. This was about something deeper, standing up for herself and for anyone who had ever been judged unfairly. She set her coffee down beside her, her movements deliberate and composed. "Look," she began, her voice steady, though there was an undercurrent of emotion that made her words hit harder. "I get it. We live in a world where people like to put others into neat little boxes. You see someone like me, casual clothes, maybe not as polished as you'd like, and you assume you know my story. But you don't." The woman's expression hardened, though her eyes darted nervously toward the growing audience. "I didn't mean," Emma held up a hand, cutting her off gently but firmly. "No, you did. And it's okay. Because, honestly, I'm used to it. People make snap judgments all the time. But here's the thing. Those judgments, they're not about me. They're about you." The crowd gasped softly, the quiet sound rippling like a wave through the atrium. Emma could see the cracks forming in the woman's composed exterior, a flicker of vulnerability flashing across her face. It was clear she wasn't used to being confronted like this, especially not in public. "You don't know why I'm here," Emma continued, her voice rising slightly but still controlled. "You don't know if I've had a hard week, or if this mall is my one escape, or if I just wanted a quiet place to sit and think. But you saw me, and you made a decision about who I am. And I think if you're honest with yourself, you'll realize that says more about your fears than anything about me." The woman blinked rapidly, her composure wavering. For a moment, she seemed to shrink under the weight of Emma's words. But instead of retreating, she squared her shoulders and forced a tight smile. "Well, I was just trying to make a point," she said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Maybe I went about it the wrong way." Emma didn't respond immediately. She let the woman's words hang in the air, giving her space to hear them herself. The crowd, too, seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, Emma spoke, her tone soft but firm. "We all make mistakes. The real question is what we do after we realize them. Do we double down, or do we try to be better?" The woman's lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, but she hesitated. The silence between them was heavy, almost unbearable. Emma could see the struggle playing out on the woman's face, the battle between pride and the desire to acknowledge a deeper truth. And then, as if the moment couldn't stretch any further, someone in the crowd clapped. The sound was sudden and startling, cutting through the tension like a knife. It was followed by another clap, and then another, until a small ripple of applause filled the air. The woman turned, her face flushing with embarrassment, while Emma simply sat there, her expression calm but unreadable. She hadn't sought the crowd's approval, but their reaction seemed to underscore the importance of what had just transpired. As the applause died down, Emma looked up at the woman one last time. "It's never too late to choose kindness," she said quietly, her words carrying a weight that lingered even as the woman turned and walked away. The echo of applause faded, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Emma Bennett sat quietly on the bench, her expression calm yet thoughtful. She was not basking in the attention. Instead, she seemed to be processing the moment as deeply as anyone else. Across from her, Victoria Caldwell stood motionless, her polished exterior now appearing like a fragile mask threatening to crack. The hum of the mall resumed as curious onlookers slowly dispersed, though some lingered, their eyes still fixed on the woman in the designer outfit. Victoria's hands clutched the strap of her handbag, her knuckles white. She had come to the mall that day for a different kind of distraction, hoping that a few indulgent purchases might fill the void that had crept into her life. Instead, she found herself standing in the middle of the atrium, exposed and vulnerable in ways she hadn't anticipated. The confrontation had sparked a firestorm of emotions inside her defensiveness, shame, and something deeper, something raw. Emma stood slowly, her movements deliberate. Her eyes met Victoria's with a gaze that wasn't harsh but steady, filled with a quiet intensity. "You didn't expect this, did you?" Emma asked softly, her voice carrying just enough for Victoria to hear. Victoria shook her head almost imperceptibly. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't." The vulnerability in those two words caught Emma off guard. She had expected defiance or even an abrupt exit, but instead, she saw a flicker of something real, something that reminded her of a version of herself she rarely shared with others. "You know," Emma began, her tone measured but inviting, "I didn't plan on having my Saturday ruined by someone questioning my worth. But here we are." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, though her lips pressed into a thin line. "I wasn't questioning your worth," she said, her tone defensive again, though the words lacked their earlier sharpness. She stopped abruptly, as if the truth of her intentions were too tangled to unravel in front of a stranger. Emma raised an eyebrow. "You just what?" she prompted gently, though there was no mistaking the edge in her voice. Victoria exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging ever so slightly. "I guess." She paused, struggling to find the words. "I guess I didn't realize how much I still care about what people think." The admission hung in the air, startling not only Emma, but also Victoria herself. Her carefully curated image, a shield she had spent years crafting, now felt suffocating, brittle under the weight of her own expectations. Emma softened at the words, her stance relaxing. "That's not an easy thing to admit," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "Caring about what people think, it's human. But letting it control you? That's something else." Victoria looked away, her eyes scanning the atrium as if searching for an escape. I wasn't always like this," she said, her words tumbling out faster now, as though the dam had broken. "Growing up, I was the one people judged, the one they looked down on. I swore I'd never feel that way again." Emma's heart tightened at the revelation. It wasn't hard to picture a younger version of this woman, one without the tailored blazer and designer bag, standing in the shadows of those who had everything she wanted but couldn't afford. The image was painfully clear, and Emma felt a pang of empathy, though she didn't let it completely cloud her judgment. "And now you're the one doing the judging," Emma said softly, the words not accusatory but matter of fact. Victoria flinched as though the statement had struck her physically. "I didn't mean to," she said hurriedly. "It's just when I saw you sitting there, looking so at ease." She trailed off, struggling to articulate the swirl of emotions that had driven her to speak out. "I guess I thought you couldn't possibly understand." Emma's eyebrows knit together in confusion. "Understand what? What it's like to be looked down on," Victoria said, her voice trembling slightly. "To feel like you don't belong. To fight every day just to prove you're good enough." The words landed heavily between them, the weight of Victoria's unspoken struggles suddenly palpable. Emma felt a swell of understanding, though it was laced with sadness. Here was a woman who had spent her life running from her pain, only to project it onto others in an attempt to protect herself. Emma hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Victoria," she began, her voice steady but layered with emotion. "We all carry things we don't show the world. Pain, fear, insecurity, they're not excuses for how we treat others, but they're part of what makes us human. You're not alone in feeling like you don't belong. But judging someone else won't make that feeling go away. Victoria's eyes glistened as she looked at Emma, her polished mask slipping further. "I just don't know how to stop," she admitted, her voice breaking. Emma stepped closer, her expression softening further. "Maybe it starts with a little honesty," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "With yourself and with others."